Hello, my name is Oscar Madrigal. I am the chair of the South Pasadena PTA Council Special Needs Committee. We are interviewing the candidates for school board, and today we are here with Alan Reynolds. Alan, thank you for joining us, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you to the PTA and the special needs committees. Um, for myself, I'm a parent of a special needs student as well as another mainstream student. I myself went through our school system. I grew up in South Pasadena. I went to Calvary for preschool, Monterey Hills, and then the middle school and the high school, and graduated the high school in 2002. Personally, because I was very young when I started school, I actually went through the RSP that we had at the time. And the resources that, from 20, 30 years ago were a whole lot less than we have now. So it's definitely been interesting to see what it's like to have the resources available now that weren't available 30 years ago. Personally, after I graduated high school in South Pass, I went to USC and have an aerospace engineering degree. Um, I'm actually currently doing online school myself, working on a master's in technology management. So it gave me an additional view at it after seeing my wife go through master's in management herself recently, also with USC. My connection to the schools, obviously personally as an alumnus, has also been very much grown through my experience as a parent as well now. Briefly did have my son over at Arroyo Vista when special needs was there for preschool through um, I guess it was through kindergarten, and then they transitioned over to Monterey Hills to join my daughter who was there already. That experience that I gained interacting more deeply with the teachers as well as the administration gave me a different view than, say, a parent that didn't have that experience. Oftentimes, the special needs parents have different expectations of teachers and administration than mainstream parents. It gives us that higher expectation and higher view on added interaction. And that's something I think is key when looking at how we need to continue to grow and improve our schools. Thank you.
Thank you. South Pasadena will have to build a lot more housing in the next few years. Right now, our school system is at capacity. What do you plan to do to try to plan for the potential new students and current overcrowding?
Well, something that's interesting, I think, in this one is that we need to, first off, interface with the city government as well as the local county government and the state government to work to mitigate that growth. Personally, having served on our commissions in town previously on Parks and Recreation Commission as well as Freeway and Transportation Commission, that infrastructure background and knowing what the impacts of various things through town will cause on a greater scale is something I do bring to potentially to the board. I do know that there are various committees as well as the council itself working to reduce the level of growth that will be mandated. I have noted myself as a parent at Monterey Hills that it is twice as big than when I went there 30 years ago. There are twice as many classes or more. So there has been growth within the sites. And I think before we look at, opening up another school site, we have to look at what growth is available and where we can add classroom space um, as we move forward, because we can't expand the individual classrooms themselves. We can't put more kids in these classes. And as far as the special needs, as that grows, we then have to find ways where we can kind of make sure that we're grouping students together in ways that make sense, where we bring them into mainstream classrooms that resources have to be available. Because we have a class of 30 students, there's no way an individual student's getting any attention. So where we can grow within the individual school sites, I think is the first place before going towards opening up another elementary school. And so we have to kind of take a methodical approach. Is we just go and open up another school that costs too much, but we also have to look at what the traffic impacts of having more students each school is. I know it's already crazy, and so there's a lot of options. We have to be kind of open and available to what our options are, and then listen to both the community members as well as some experts to see what route is best.
Thank you. As the number of students with the highest learning needs in special education increases, what can you do to ensure that our district is equipped to best serve them?
So Something I noted in some of the various school board meetings that happened recently, if you look at the budgetary items, the sheer cost of outsourcing some of these needs to other cities that have the resources to handle the highest special needs is significant. If we could find more ways to do more in-house, more on-site, we would probably save ourselves some financial impact. Something that was noted to me back when my son was very young, before he even started preschool at the special needs preschool, was that you're lucky you're in South Pass. If you were in LA Unified, you would have even less resources. So it's important to recognize that we already have a large amount of resources, but it's also important to note that there are many, many students in mainstream that should have an IEP. It's something that, as a special needs parent, you can look kind of with a different viewpoint, saying, that kid could really use a little help, and you wish that you would. I don't want to go and tell other parents what to do, but being able to speak up for your child and understanding what the special needs programs are, what the IEP means, is important. I remember talking to one parent, and they were worried that their kid was going to be in a classroom full of kids with helmets and banging their heads and drooling all over the place. And the view of that as special needs to be changed. We need to have almost an education of parents and education of the community, what goes on in special needs, what speech therapy is, what OT is, what all these different resources are, where we can grow them, and then we can potentially bring more students into those programs, and it's particularly group therapy programs. And if we can grow there, because we need to find ways for oftentimes social interaction. It's all well and good to have an individual student that is getting that input, but unless they can interact with mainstream students as well, the growth isn't there. It will always be kind of forced to only interact with their own group. So it has to be a integrated system that is more encompassing. So I'm not sure that 100% answers the question, but it kind of gives a little input.
Thank you. How would you work to ensure board and school-based decisions are transparent?
I think the key thing towards transparency is to not do things behind closed doors, to do things open, to get input, to not having it be in secrecy, to making sure that if a decision is made a certain way, the explanation for it is also available. I mean, to use the perspective of the task proposal that included a greater number of wellness days, or greater than none, that seemed like the board just received and filed it. And it takes a lot of pushing to get things done in any town. But in this town, it's something that's been noted in the past. You have to form a committee to do things, to get things, to move things forward at all levels, not just the schools. But what I think a key thing is to make sure that the reasoning behind something is also given. It's not just, well, we didn't want to do it. Or if there's just the resources aren't there, or if the state is mandating something be a certain way, or if not enough people were interested in it, or we have to have not just an open decision-making process, but an open perspective of reverse input, where we're getting back the information from the school board as to why a decision was made. I know the school board has a very, very strong perspective of speaking with one voice, and that's why you have the school board president as the voice for the school board. But it's also important, if there is dissension, if there is a perspective that's different, to make sure that the community understands where things stand. It's not a black and white. It's not a yes or no. If it's a no, then the question becomes, why was it a no? What would need to be done to make it a yes? Is it financial, or is it just that there weren't enough people, or was it there's just not a great enough understanding and more research needs to be done? So transparency involves interaction beyond just having everything just done and open. You have to have all of the decision making and input back from the school board in the open as well.
Thank you. How should the district best focus on pre-kindergarten populations in our community to promote school readiness? What knowledge do you bring regarding child development?
So I have no expertise in child development other than being a parent. And I think I've made that very, very clear in almost every statement I've made, written or otherwise. But I do bring the experience, obviously, of having had a child in our preschool in the district. The way things are right now, you can't, there's no public preschool. We had it for a little while, it cost a little extra money, but it was taken away in favor of improving and boosting up the TK aspect. A lot of early childhood development, meaning prior to kindergarten, is we need to push the state to mandate more. The resources to do that aren't there. The location to do that, we'd have to find another location. The funding is not there. An awful lot of this has to come from a higher level in order to push the state in that direction. It's all well and good to say we want to provide a preschool or pre-K education, but if there's no resources, no locations, and no tax dollars and no funding for it, there's not as much as we can do. So we have to make sure in our current system that there is a good knowledge to the parents that aren't quite having their kids in school yet of what is expected of a kindergartner or a TK student, depending on their age, so that development is there. An awful lot of it's on the parents and when what they're doing, but for the moment, we have to focus on providing that information to parents prior to kindergarten. Oftentimes you have parents coming to town just for the schools, and it's gonna be hard to do that. So I think that to expand pre-kindergarten education, there has to be pushed towards the state level or even the federal level to mandate and increase funding for those things as a key and important thing. And that includes things like, daycare costs as well. I mean, it's all well and good to say, oh, there's a half a day of kindergarten, but then what? And not everybody wants their kid to go off site. So it has to be a situation where we push for more resources in order to accommodate that, because right now there's not a whole lot more we can do, unfortunately.
Thank you. How do you plan to hold the district accountable in improving outcomes for students? What data elements would you focus on?
If I could ask for some clarification, what you mean specifically by data elements in this case?
So I think what sort of data points would you look at in terms of improving school outcomes? Would you look at test scores? Would you look at surveys? What are the things that you would focus on as a board member?
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the clarification. So I think it's difficult to really define school outcome, particularly right after graduation. I mean, oftentimes people look at college admittance, but not every student wants to go to college or succeeds in college. Additionally, if you look at it from test scores, within our district, we have people of various affluence and various different abilities to take tests. I think it's been seen more and more in our higher education world that things like SAT and ACT scores are not necessarily always a relevant measure of how well a child or a student will perform in college. Then right now we use so many of the various student assessment or standardized assessment tests in order to determine outcomes, but that is just one measure. We have to use a dynamic and multi-layered approach to analyzing student successes. This involves, basically we need to put more. We could use questionnaires as one step, but who's going to answer them? Is it going to be the parents' input? Then that's shaded. Going to be the students' input? Then that's shaded. We have to find ways to kind of have an all-encompassing way of pulling in information, and how we're going to analyze that then becomes a question. A test is a yes, no. Yeah, we're doing good. We're doing bad. It's black and white. But any person is not a yes, no situation. We have to find ways to gather data on emotional background, emotional input, and how students are progressing in that sense as well. And you can have well-rounded, wonderful person that just doesn't do well on tests. And so we have to find other ways to access that input and have, I think, a multifaceted approach.
Thank you. The inclusion of special education students into mainstream classrooms has been shown to have positive benefits for all students. How will you advocate for inclusion and support our administrators and teachers to create effective opportunities for inclusion?
So what I've noticed personally is that there was a certain point past which, about halfway through kindergarten, that the biggest issue for my son personally was that he was around other special needs children. And while he was getting a significant amount of educational resources, he wasn't getting the child development resources that he needs by interacting with mainstream children in order to know how to behave. Now, I think it's somewhat of a misnomer that every so-called special needs child needs to learn to act like a normal child. So, but at the same time, we are going to have to make sure that our children are able to interact with each other regardless of their learning process, regardless of their developmental process. So the only way to do that is to integrate both into a safe environment. And that is going to put an awful lot on teachers to control that particular environment. I know, for instance, my son's second grade teacher did an amazing job integrating my son into that classroom, pivoting him back to focus when he was distracted, including him in things, and making sure that he didn't get pulled out of the class all the time, making sure that he wasn't singled out as something special or unique, and making him feel uncomfortable. And so it's important to have teacher education as well as resources from the special needs groups to be able to push in and pull out as needed on a case-by-case basis. And I think one of the key things that we've learned is the more that he's been able to interact with mainstream children in a school setting, the more we've seen his behavioral development push. And so I'm putting this as a very personal perspective, but the same thing is true of any of the very special needs children, is that every one of them has a different issue. And I hate to put it that way, but that's how, from a normal a mainstream perspective, it's often viewed. But every child, even mainstream, has their own individual characteristics, and we have to find ways to have any additional education that's required, interaction between the mainstream teachers and the special needs care providers and teachers as well, in order to make sure that that's well defined on how those resources are. Something that I've noticed, particularly with all of our online teaching, is that we've pushed for more guidance, more people to push in and help, because he has a hard time focusing, particularly in asynchronous classes. Other students do much better in asynchronous classes. And so the resources are there. We also have to educate parents and have them understand what resources are there so they can advocate for it and fight for it. And sometimes there's a cultural difference there. Sometimes you have a background where you're not interested or knowing or should push, and oftentimes that it's on the parents to push, and we have to make sure that there is a perspective from the district to providing a better knowledge of what the resources are so that they can be chosen and then pushed for.
Thank you. As the students in special education begin high school, planning for their transition into adulthood becomes a responsibility of the school as part of their IEP. How would you support our district staff and teachers in creating and implementing effective transition programs for our students?
So that's not one that I've had to deal with quite yet personally. I mean, personally, I don't think we're not ourselves ready for that. But from the perspective of thinking back to transitioning myself, which is now, it's been a few years now, there it was oftentimes a push to put students into college. That's the key aspect of South Pasadena. Now, when you're talking special needs students, that may not be the goal, and there has to be a interactive and knowledgeable, comprehensive look at things from each individual families in what the goals are. We have to keep in mind that if not every child is going to be going to college, special needs or otherwise, what does adulthood look like for those individual students? So we have to find ways, not for counseling or for interaction, to make sure that decision and the information that our schools, our teachers, and the various other resources have that they can provide it to families, particularly those with special needs, is made available and made known, so that the parents of the children that are going through this in high school will know kind of more about, well, what can I expect? Now, sometimes that's getting input from outside organizations as to what resources might be. And unfortunately, whether or not you have families, what level of support are they going to have for their children when their children do graduate from high school, when suddenly that's no longer a resource for the family to have their student in school and have all of this extra support. So sometimes it really has to be a school, family, and outside resource triumvirate of interaction and integration to kind of get a better kind of transition, to make sure it's not just like you graduate in June, you're a senior and you're done, and there's no resources for you. So we have to find ways to work with families, work with the schools, and also work with outside organizations outside of the school, because that transition will be transitioning to something more than just the school. And I think that's key. I mean, it's key for even for non-special needs students, but I think that with it, obviously, it's something that within a special needs community is we need to be even more aware of, and we are oftentimes thinking ahead. What are we going to do when my son is, or my daughter is 18? And it's a little bit different outlook than sometimes is seen from the more mainstream students. And so having the school as the hub of that, having the school be able to say, hey, you can go find more information here, or you can go research that there, or we already have done that. We know this about your student because we've worked with them for the last 10 years. We should be able to provide guidance. Now, it's all on the schools. It has to involve the parents as well.
Thank you. Having a solid multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS, can ensure that we support our students who are falling behind, for example, our EL students. How will you, as a board member, ensure that our instructional focus includes the development of a strong MTSS?
Can you clarify? Oh, okay, multi-tiered support system. Yes. I think it's important to maintain continuing education, not just among the students themselves, but amongst the administrators, the staff, and the teachers, so that we know what resources are out there, what new research is available, so that we can then implement it. Now, I mean, I look at it from a personal perspective. At different subject matters, different students are going to do well at, whether it's math or more written language. And I think oftentimes, once you get to a certain level, it's easier to excel at one subject and then lag behind on another. And making sure that there is a proactive approach to make sure that things don't lag too far behind, but also understand that particularly within the special needs community, there's a level of frustration in a student when they're not getting something, and then we can't be too absolute. So I think it's important that we maintain that support structure based upon individual students as best as possible, particularly those with IEP, but also across the board for those that are not special needs as well, because there will be students that perform better in certain ways, and they need to have a more dynamic kind of accommodation for that, while still pushing towards the success and goals that there are. So I think it involves an interactivity between families and the schools, and then when that information is gathered by the schools, it needs to be provided to the board so that the systems can be supported and funded and put in place correctly.
Thank you. The state of California has adopted social emotional learning competencies for all schools. What policies would you support to create? What policies would you support or create to ensure that our school district is meeting these competencies?
So unfortunately, I haven't read that specific set of policies. I mean, generally familiar with the terms, obviously, but I think what's important in a policy is to do a significant amount of fact finding. I think that especially right now with our current school situation, at home, I think there is less input to the teachers. There's not as much hands-on there, and so it's harder to really know what's going on except for by asking parents, and that should always be a part of it anyways. But I think that right now we need to find, particularly for the special needs students, ways to get that input, way to understand how they're doing, and then finding various different layers of how the emotional response is. Right, there's a whole push for the wellness days, and that's one way to handle, the social emotional competencies of mainstream students, but those are going to be different for other students. And so making sure that the resources are there. You look at my particular experiences that emotionally, sometimes a special needs child can be a basket case very quickly, and then there's days where they're the most loving and capable person in the world. And so having kind of a gentle approach and yet firm and understanding of it. I looked at a perspective where my son was doing after school care and he was just too tired and it was just too long of a day for him, or things like that. So we kind of have to gain input and repeatedly, and it has to be very iterative and has to be very very individualized as much as possible, though at the same time resources for that are always difficult.
Thank you. Given that South Pasadena receives far less in per pupil spending than neighboring districts due to state formulas, what approaches would you advise to maximize revenue to meet district needs?
So I think if I recall correctly, I mean, one of the main reasons why we don't receive as much money is because we have such high performing schools. And additionally, if you look at us compared to, say, La Cañada or San Marino, which are the obvious comparisons, um, they have a much higher parcel tax to fund the schools than we do. And so if we don't want this to stay particular, and we don't want to put additional parcel tax in place above and beyond what we already have, we have to find ways to kind of do things more economically. I mentioned previously about sometimes when we are taking individuals and putting them in places outside of the district to handle the specific special needs, that ends up costing the school district something on the order of the cost of an entire teacher. And so the more we can do in-house, the more we can do under one roof, or in this case, 5 roofs, the better. The more we can, keep things done by the district as opposed to branching out, the better. Now, occasionally there's something that's more cost effective to work with a larger organization. So you have to take a look at which places that's true and which places it's more of better to keep to ourselves. And so it really has to be done where we take a look at the individual cases and find what's the best approach. And now oftentimes you say, we don't always want to say, well, you have to have a certain number of students that are interested or needing a certain thing before you put it in place. But at times, even if you have 5 or 10 students that want something, it's sometimes cheaper to do it in-house than going outside. So it is a bit of a case-by-case thing, but I have the feeling that we need to take a look at what would be better served to keep and what within work with a multi-district collaboration in order to help keep the cost reasonable.
Thank you. What is your position on continuing dual immersion programs into the middle school or high school, especially with current funding challenges? How would you speak to parents who are concerned about continuing or eliminating these programs? And how do you support equity in language learning opportunities for students that cannot get into the DI programs?
So first off, I think from my perspective, one of the problems with the language programs of this type at the middle school or high school level is that the access to them at the elementary school levels is not equitable. You look at, I think Monterey Hills has a large Spanish immersion program, whereas Marengo has a large Mandarin immersion program, if I recall correctly. I don't have a student at Marengo, but I believe that's the case. And then when you get to the middle school or high school, the only student that had a chance to get in those were the ones at particular elementary school. I think that if we're going to expand those programs, we kind of have to start at the lowest level. We have to start at the elementary school. We have to look at it. Should there be a Spanish immersion program at all 3 elementary schools? Should there be a Mandarin immersion program at all 3 elementary schools? And what would the cost of that be? I'm assuming quite high, but at the same time, for the community, for the parents and families, that might be something worth looking into. When we push into the middle school and high school levels, it's key to make sure that if there is enough desire for those programs, that we find a way to maintain them. And the problem, of course, is, as you mentioned, is funding. It becomes a trade-off. Where are the money? Where are we going to? What are we going to fund? But I think that sometimes we have this mentality that we lose something along the way, and finding ways to bring people into that program to take a look at the funding and take a look at the interest and find the balance between the two. And I think that the interest level and the funding needs to start at the elementary school level. And I know we're hopping into the middle school and high school with these questions, and it's come up a couple of times already in past questionnaires and things like that. But I think it's key to start at the beginning and grow it up, while still finding ways to support it at the middle school and high school level as well.
Thank you. The number of students with active IEPs in the district has increased in the past couple of years. How will you address the funding challenges that this will bring to our district?
So I've alluded to this a couple of times, and maybe it's because I had read ahead in the questions a little bit. But I think that the two ways of looking, well, three ways of looking at it are: one, um, where can we find ways that we can take an IEP and make it more of a group IEP, where there's different layers of it, more things we can do in groups so that the cost spreads a little further. And the individual plan is for an individual student, but if we can find ways to group students together in ways that allow them to track together and gain the benefit of a program versus having extreme individualized responses. Now, that may not be possible in every case. Additionally, as I mentioned before, the more we can not farm out individual students to other districts that have these capabilities, the more we can keep the money in-house, the better we can provide services. Additionally, contrary to what I just said, the more we can find a way to spread the costs in a multi-district situation that would be improved. Now, looking at a district the size of LA Unified, that's probably a little bit too big. Would we look at local ones like La Cañada, San Marino, Alhambra, ones like that? We can find ways to maybe spread the cost between the districts. So those three responses would be my personal preferences for where we might go at this time without having more research done myself.
Thank you. Included in the South Pasadena Unified Mission is a commitment to recognizing and valuing the diversity, backgrounds, and abilities of all students and providing them the encouragement to reach their full potential. So we have two questions related to this particular mission. The first is, according to EdSource data, the 2019 California Smarter Balance test results indicate that achievement gaps exist by race and ethnicity and income levels in our district. What is your plan to address these gaps?
So there are multiple things to address, I should say. I think that we have to find ways to make sure that the resources the district has are available to the students across the board. There's a direct correlation between how much time, energy, and as money a parent family has and how much attention they get from the schools. And so that while I don't believe that it's been in place for beyond just a school district, and so it needs to be something addressed outside the schools and inside the schools. And then additionally, as far, I think the last item you said was, because you broke up a little bit, you said diversity, equity, and achievement gaps. So oftentimes then there's a financial difference between how much a student can achieve. Oftentimes when you have a more affluent family, there's more resources in place and their achievement is greater, whether it's tutoring or study time or less chaos at home, and sometimes a little bit harder to control. So making sure there's resources provided by the schools to mitigate that will be key. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Give me one sec. Thank you. The second question related to this mission is, how will you help to increase teacher diversity in all schools? What can you do to make our district more diversified and reflect the diversity of our community and county?
So I think it's key to student achievement for them to see themselves in their teachers, also in successful individuals outside of the schools. And so the more we can get teachers in place that reflect the community at large, the better. So I think I don't want to go too deeply into it, but I believe there are various ballot measures in place to potentially improve the ability of selection to increase diversity amongst the hiring practices. And even without that in place, we can be proactive about it. We want to hire the best teachers, but we also have to include the racial diversity as part of the measure of what's the best. And so I think it's important, if you look at it from the perspective of gender, to have female science teachers, female math teachers, so the girls can see that they can achieve that. And same thing is true of ethnic backgrounds. If you see, we want to make sure that across the board you have that perspective. I think there was a questionnaires I've seen online. Well, when was the first time you had a teacher who wasn't white? And most of the time, people say, "Well, college." Sorry, my internet glitching there. And then so we have to make sure that the one of the best ways to improve our systemic issues is to start at the beginning, and that is in the schools. And so including race and gender and various other backgrounds into the process of determining who's the best teacher is important beyond just education and previous jobs.
Thank you. When the school district purchases curriculum or programming such as Second Step, how does the board ensure that they are receiving accurate information and holding school administration accountable for the implementation of these programs?
So that's tough because there has to be some degree of trust that the schools and the administration is providing that information to the board. It's hard to have oversight without input, without the information. At the same time, we encourage parents to work within the administration before bringing things to the school board. You look at various times, you look at how the city is structured with various city commissions. It's something to potentially look into apparently PTAs providing that input themselves. The PTAs are a resource that can be used to gather information to then work as a group to oversight themselves. I think that oftentimes an individual is ignored in a system, whereas a group can work together to achieve those things. So I think there needs to be an increased input, and if there are issues, if there are things of that sort, the PTA can act as an additional community group to push the administration and or the school board to make sure that all of that information is available, so that things aren't hidden, so things that are transparent. And so we have to make sure that the school board is getting the information in order to hold accountability. And it's not like the school board's the police. We can't go in and investigate. But so we have to rely on our community to provide that input if it's not being done through the administration.
Thank you. Alan, we want to thank you for your time, and we want to give you this opportunity to give us any closing remarks. Are there any questions that we have not asked you that you'd like to address, or do you have anything you'd like to close with?
Well, first off, I'd like to thank you. The special needs community is obviously something that has been a very big part of our lives over the last 5 or 6 years at this point. And I mean, it's something to keep in mind that while there's amazing resources that our schools have and some amazing teachers that have been able to support students, that we also work with parents in their resources. Major issues getting resources that I need for our children. And I think it's important to make sure that all parents and all families have that same experience, whether regardless of background, regardless of socioeconomic background, gender, or ethnicity. And I think that oftentimes that there's a cultural difference. I mean, I've spoken with parents, and culturally different groups are more willing to go and push and advocate, and other ones are more want to work within the system. So as a parent and as an alumnus of the school system, I want to make sure that the schools don't always rely on parent advocacy in order to push student resources, and that we make sure that when we see as a school an individual family pushing for something, that there are other families that aren't pushing for it because they don't know that they can, or aren't or don't feel comfortable doing that. And so use that as a measure of what else needs to be done, and suggest it and be proactive from a school side when you see a response from a family side that there are other families needing that. And so I think it's important that there be a community-based response and outlook within our schools. And we have a fairly small town. And I know within the special needs community, there's been plenty of times when it's been something where I've been able to talk to other parents and be able to provide my insight and input and help them. And I'm hoping that that's something that other parents will continue to do within the community as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan.